The Battle of Rzhev-Vyazma in 1942 emerged from the bitter aftermath of the failed German drive toward Moscow in late 1941. Following the collapse of Operation Typhoon and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensive, the Wehrmacht was forced to abandon its immediate hopes of seizing the Soviet capital. However, instead of complete retreat, Hitler ordered his forces to hold a vast salient protruding toward Moscow, centered on the towns of Rzhev, Vyazma, and Sikevka. This salient, roughly 160 kilometers west of Moscow, would become one of the most brutal and least remembered fronts of the Second World War. The strategic context of early 1942 was shaped by mutual exhaustion. The Soviet winter counteroffensive had pushed German forces back from the gates of Moscow, but at immense cost. The Red Army had advanced along a broad front from Kalinin in the north to Orel in the south, reclaiming towns and rail junctions, but overextending its supply lines. The German Army Group Center, though battered, stabilized its positions during the winter, forming a defensive arc from the Volga River near Rzhev to the Ugra River south of Vyazma. This Rzhev salient placed German troops within 200 kilometers of Moscow and allowed them to threaten the capital again, an intolerable situation for Soviet command. By January 1942, both sides faced daunting logistical and human challenges. The Wehrmacht had suffered nearly 400,000 casualties during the failed Moscow offensive and the subsequent retreat, while Soviet losses were even higher, estimated at over 1 million killed, wounded, or missing during the winter operations. Supply shortages, frostbite, and the destruction of transport infrastructure compounded the difficulties. Yet Stalin's Stavka viewed 1942 as a year of opportunity, believing that the German army, weakened by winter and stretched thin across the Eastern Front, could be decisively defeated before it could recover. In this context, the Soviet High Command prepared a series of large-scale offensives aimed at eliminating the Rzhev-Vyazma salient and encircling Army Group Center. The Kalinin and Western Fronts, under Generals Ivan Konev and Georgy Zhukov, were ordered to attack from the north and south, respectively. Their goal was to break through German lines around Rzhev and Vyazma, link up west of the salient, and destroy the German Ninth Army, commanded by General Walter Model. Supporting operations by the 33rd, 39th, and 29th Armies would exploit any breakthroughs to encircle and annihilate German forces trapped east of Smolensk. For Hitler and the German High Command, the Rzhev salient served as both a shield and a springboard. It protected the approaches to Smolensk and provided a forward base for potential renewed offensives toward Moscow once conditions allowed. However, its maintenance required enormous resources. The Ninth Army, with approximately 350,000 men, was tasked with defending an elongated front of over 500 kilometers. Despite the difficult terrain, dense forests, rivers, and marshland, Model constructed layered defensive lines, integrating bunkers, minefields, and fortified villages. His doctrine emphasized flexible defense and rapid local counterattacks, a stark contrast to earlier rigid German tactics. As the winter of 1941-42 turned to spring, both armies braced for renewed fighting. Soviet commanders envisioned a decisive blow that would destroy Army Group Center and liberate vast regions of occupied territory. German leaders, conversely, viewed the salient as essential to maintaining control of the Central Front. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest and most complex campaigns of the war, a campaign that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives without fundamentally changing the front lines. The preconditions for the Battle of Rzhev-Vyazma reflected the larger struggle of the Eastern Front. Two exhausted superpowers locked in a contest of endurance, each driven by strategic imperatives that allowed no retreat. For the Soviets, it was a chance to avenge the humiliations of 1941 and secure Moscow's safety once and for all. For the Germans, it was the last defensive bastion of their failed eastern ambition. Neither side knew that the struggle for the Rzhev salient would last nearly 18 months, becoming a grinding battle of attrition that soldiers would later call the Rzhev meat grinder. The opening phase of the Battle of Rzhev-Vyazma began in January 1942 as the Soviet winter counteroffensive expanded beyond the Moscow region. Following the success in pushing the Germans back from the capital, Soviet leadership ordered a continuation of the offensive along the entire central sector. The Western and Kalinin fronts received directives to exploit the disorganized state of the German Ninth Army and to advance westward toward Vyazma and Smolensk. The overarching goal was ambitious: to encircle and destroy Army Group Center, whose divisions still held deep salients threatening Moscow. The terrain west of Moscow was among the harshest in Europe for winter warfare. Forests, rivers, and swamps covered the region, while temperatures remained below 30 degrees C for much of January. Snowdrifts, frozen streams, and destroyed roads slowed the Red Army's movement. Nevertheless, Soviet units pressed forward with determination. The 39th Army, supported by ski troops and cavalry, struck toward Rzhev from the north, while the 29th and 31st Armies attacked from the east. South of Vyazma, the 33rd Army under Lieutenant General Mikhail Yefremov launched an assault aimed at cutting the German communications network linking Vyazma to Smolensk. At first, Soviet progress appeared promising. The exhausted German units, weakened by months of retreat and short on fuel and ammunition, were forced to give ground. Entire sectors of the front were held by ad hoc formations composed of rear echelon personnel, Luftwaffe ground crews, and training units pressed into service. The Red Army advanced rapidly through snow-covered forests, capturing towns such as Olenino and Bailey. In some sectors, Soviet cavalry penetrated more than 60 kilometers behind German lines, exploiting gaps in the defense. However, as the offensive deepened, the initial momentum began to fade. The Red Army's supply system was not prepared for sustained winter operations on such a scale. Rail lines were destroyed, trucks immobilized by frost, and horses perished by the thousands. Ammunition shortages became critical, and food rations dwindled as logistics collapsed. Meanwhile, German command stabilized its defense. General Model, taking command of the Ninth Army in mid-January, rapidly reorganized his front. He ordered the construction of new defensive positions and redeployed mobile reserves to threatened sectors. Despite severe shortages, Model's leadership restored discipline and coordination, preventing a complete collapse. By early February, the Soviet offensive had achieved deep but uneven penetrations. The 33rd Army reached the outskirts of Vyazma, but soon found itself isolated. Its supply lines, stretching through forests and villages held by German garrisons, were constantly ambushed. Attempts by neighboring Soviet armies to link up failed due to poor coordination and inadequate communications. South of Rzhev, the 29th and 39th Armies advanced into a dangerous salient that soon became vulnerable to German counterattacks. The Germans responded with rapid, localized counteroffensives. Using small but well-coordinated armored groups, Model struck at the flanks of overextended Soviet formations. Near Belly, elements of the 5th Panzer Division cut off several Soviet regiments, forcing them to fight their way out through deep snow and freezing temperatures. The Luftwaffe, despite limited fuel and the winter weather, provided crucial air support, bombing Soviet columns and dropping supplies to encircle German troops. Throughout February and March 1942, the front became fragmented. Pockets of Soviet forces fought in isolation behind German lines, supplied intermittently by air or by partisan guides. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred south of Vyazma, where Yefremov's 33rd Army, cut off and surrounded, continued to resist for weeks. Lacking supplies and reinforcements, its men fought until mid-April, before the remnants were annihilated. Yefremov himself reportedly refused evacuation and perished among his soldiers. Despite localized Soviet successes, the main objective, encirclement of Army Group Center, remained unfulfilled. The Wehrmacht maintained its hold on the Rzhev-Vyazma salient, though at enormous cost. The Ninth Army's losses for the winter months exceeded 60,000 men, while Soviet casualties were far higher, with several armies reduced to half their initial strength. The opening phase of the battle demonstrated both the potential and limitations of the Red Army's winter strategy. It revealed the growing operational competence of Soviet command, but also its logistical weakness and over-reliance on mass assaults. For the Germans, it was a bitter lesson in endurance. The Rzhev front had survived the Soviet storm, but it would remain a constant source of attrition and fear, a salient both vital and perilous, where the next offensive could begin at any time. By the spring of 1942, the Soviet winter counteroffensive had lost its momentum, but the Soviet High Command, believing the German army to be near collapse, ordered a continuation of the offensive in the central sector. The Rzhev-Vyazma salient, projecting deep toward Moscow, appeared to offer an opportunity for a decisive victory if the German Ninth Army could be surrounded and destroyed. The Stavka envisioned a large-scale encirclement operation involving the Kalinin front to the north and the Western front to the south, converging west of Vyazma. Yet beneath this ambitious plan lay serious weaknesses: stretched logistics, exhausted troops, and unreliable intelligence regarding German strength. By late March, the situation around the salient had stabilized. The German Ninth Army under General Model had successfully sealed the gaps in its defensive lines and reorganized its divisions into cohesive defensive sectors. Model's headquarters, based near Sikevka, oversaw a force of roughly 28 divisions, including 4 panzer and 3 motorized divisions, supported by strong artillery and air units. The Ninth Army's primary defensive belt extended along the Volga and Vazuza rivers, forming a natural barrier reinforced by trenches, minefields, and concrete bunkers. Behind it, a second line of defense connected the towns of Olenino, Bely, and Rzhev. Despite these formidable defenses, the Soviet command was determined to strike again. The Western Front under Zhukov and the Kalinin Front under Konev regrouped their forces, preparing for renewed offensives in April. The main blow was assigned to the 39th Army, supported by the 29th and 30th Armies, which were to encircle Rzhev from the north and west. The 31st and 33rd Armies were tasked with pinning down German forces near Vyazma, while the 1st Shock Army would attack toward Bely. The scale of the planned operation was immense. Soviet records indicate that over 1.2 million men, 1,200 tanks, and more than 10,000 artillery pieces were concentrated in the central sector, yet these numbers concealed deep problems. Many divisions were understrength, with battalions numbering 300-400 men instead of the authorized 800-1,000. Tank units were short on fuel and spare parts, and communication between armies remained poor. Meanwhile, the Germans had used the lull to strengthen their positions, establish forward observation points, and improve their coordination with the Luftwaffe. In mid-April, Soviet forces renewed their assault on the Rzhev-Vyazma salient. Artillery preparation began at dawn, lasting nearly 3 hours before the infantry advanced. The 39th Army attacked the German 246th and 256th Infantry Divisions north of Rzhev, achieving initial success. Several villages were captured, and Soviet forward detachments reached within 10 kilometers of the Rzhev rail line. However, German reserves quickly counterattacked. The 5th Panzer Division, supported by elements of the 14th Motorized Division, launched a concentrated strike against the Soviet left flank, regaining lost ground. The pattern of the fighting became clear. The Red Army advanced through overwhelming numbers, but each gain was met with immediate counterblows. To the south, near Vyazma, the situation was even more difficult. The 33rd Army, still recovering from its winter encirclement, attempted to resume its offensive, but was met with heavy resistance from German fortified positions. The forests and swamps around Yukhnov made large-scale maneuvers nearly impossible. German artillery, firing from elevated ground, inflicted devastating losses on Soviet infantry formations. By the end of April, the Western Front had gained only a few kilometers at enormous cost. Tens of thousands of casualties and hundreds of destroyed tanks. Despite these setbacks, the Soviet leadership persisted. Stalin personally demanded the continuation of the offensive, convinced that the Germans were on the verge of collapse. Orders forbade local withdrawals, and commanders were instructed to hold every meter of captured ground. As a result, front lines became static killing fields. Entire Soviet battalions were annihilated while attempting to cross open ground under German fire. The Luftwaffe, operating from airfields near Smolensk and Vyazma, achieved local air superiority and carried out relentless strikes on Soviet troop concentrations and supply routes. By May, the character of the campaign had shifted from maneuver to attrition. Both sides endured continuous losses as the battle degenerated into trench warfare reminiscent of the First World War. Soldiers lived in dugouts and foxholes, enduring constant shelling and air raids. The Volga River basin became a graveyard of men and machines, villages reduced to rubble, fields littered with burned-out tanks, and forests scarred by shell fire. Medical services were overwhelmed. Soviet divisions reported thousands of cases of frostbite, typhus, and malnutrition, while German units faced similar shortages of supplies and replacements. The German command recognized the need to eliminate the Soviet footholds, threatening the salient's stability. In late May, Model launched a limited counteroffensive aimed at cutting off Soviet forces that had penetrated west of Bely and Olenino. Operation Seydlitz, as it became known, employed the 1st Panzer Division, elements of the 14th Motorized Division, and the 86th Infantry Division. In a series of rapid maneuvers, German forces encircled several Soviet rifle divisions of the 39th Army in the forests northwest of Bely. Despite desperate attempts at breakout, most of these encircled units were destroyed by early June. This operation marked a turning point within the spring phase of the battle. The Red Army's attempt to exploit its winter successes had failed to produce a breakthrough, and the German Ninth Army had regained the initiative. However, neither side achieved strategic success. The Soviet offensives demonstrated the growing operational maturity of the Red Army, its ability to coordinate multi-front operations and sustain pressure, but also its persistent deficiencies in logistics, intelligence, and communication. By mid-June 1942, the front had stabilized once again. The Rzhev-Vyazma salient remained firmly in German hands, though at the cost of severe attrition. Soviet forces, depleted and exhausted, dug in to prepare for renewed attacks later in the year. Casualties on both sides were staggering. German reports list approximately 70,000 losses during the spring battles, while Soviet sources estimate over 200,000. The front, however, remained largely unchanged. Strategically, the failure of the spring offensives forced the Soviet High Command to reconsider its approach. While attention shifted toward the southern sector of the front, where German preparations for Operation Blue were underway, the Rzhev sector would remain a festering wound. The salient continued to absorb immense Soviet resources, anchoring German defenses near Moscow, but offering little strategic gain for either side. It was a battlefield defined not by victory, but by endurance, a frozen stalemate that foreshadowed the relentless bloodletting to come in the summer and autumn of 1942. By the summer of 1942, the Soviet High Command still refused to abandon its efforts to crush the German Ninth Army and eliminate the Rzhev-Vyazma salient. Despite repeated failures during the winter and spring, the area remained a priority for Stavka, as it posed a constant threat to Moscow and consumed enormous German resources that could otherwise be deployed to the southern front. Yet, while the Wehrmacht prepared for Operation Blue in the south, its drive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, the central front around Rzhev descended into a separate war of attrition, one fought in forests, swamps, and ruined villages, with little movement and enormous cost. For the Germans, the Rzhev salient was both an advantage and a liability. On paper, it offered a strong forward position from which future operations toward Moscow might be renewed. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare, a protrusion extending 160 kilometers east of Smolensk, surrounded on three sides by Soviet forces. To hold it required constant resupply along vulnerable rail lines running through Vyazma and Smolensk, both under frequent Soviet air attack. Nevertheless, Hitler insisted that Rzhev be held at any cost, viewing its loss as a moral and strategic blow. General Walter Model, now firmly established as commander of the Ninth Army, set about transforming the salient into a fortress region. Model's defensive preparations were meticulous. By June, his army had constructed 3 defensive belts surrounding Rzhev, Sychevka, and Bely, incorporating thousands of bunkers, trenches, and minefields. Villages were converted into strongpoints, each garrisoned by infantry and supported by artillery positioned on nearby ridges. German engineers built anti-tank ditches and barbed wire entanglements along likely Soviet approach routes, while Luftwaffe units provided reconnaissance and close air support. Despite this elaborate system, morale among German troops was strained. Soldiers referred to Rzhev as the dead corner, a place from which few returned alive. Meanwhile, the Soviet Kalinin and Western fronts prepared for another large-scale assault. The summer campaign, planned for late July, was codenamed Operation Mars. While the better-known Operation Uranus would later encircle the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, Mars was designed as its northern counterpart, a massive strike intended to destroy the Ninth Army, break the Rzhev-Vyazma line, and open the road to Smolensk. Under Zhukov's overall coordination, the Red Army assembled over 1.8 million men, 3,000 tanks, and nearly 25,000 artillery pieces across a 200-kilometer sector. Yet the same issues that had plagued previous offensives persisted: poor intelligence, logistical bottlenecks, and inadequate coordination between the attacking fronts. The Soviet plan called for a series of simultaneous assaults from multiple directions. The 30th and 31st Armies of the Western Front would strike south of Rzhev, while the 39th, 22nd, and 41st Armies of the Kalinin Front attacked from the north and west. Supporting attacks by the 20th and 29th Armies aimed to fix German reserves and prevent their redeployment. The ultimate goal was encirclement, the destruction of the 9th Army in a pincer movement converging near Olenino and Sychevka. As the offensive began in late July, the Soviet artillery opened with one of the heaviest bombardments of the war to date. Entire sectors of forest and village strongpoints were flattened by shells. Soviet infantry advanced behind rolling barrages, while T-34 and KV-1 tanks pushed through the smoke toward German lines. Initial reports from the front claimed rapid progress. However, these early gains soon dissolved into chaos. German defenses, meticulously prepared, absorbed the impact and responded with devastating precision. Anti-tank guns and field artillery created deadly crossfire zones, and German machine gunners, concealed in bunkers and trenches, cut down Soviet infantry by the hundreds. In several sectors, the Red Army achieved local breakthroughs, but lacked the reserves to exploit them. Near Bely, the 39th Army penetrated 10 kilometers into the German rear, threatening to cut off supply routes to Rzhev. Yet within days, Model counterattacked with the 5th and 9th Panzer Divisions, sealing the breach and encircling several Soviet brigades. Fighting in the forests turned into close-quarters battles at ranges of less than 50 meters, where visibility was limited, and both sides suffered enormous casualties. To the south, the 31st Army's assault towards Sychevka met similar resistance. German units, including the 14th and 256th Infantry Divisions, held their positions despite continuous Soviet pressure. Repeated attacks over open ground resulted in catastrophic losses for the attackers. The Luftwaffe maintained air superiority during clear weather, bombing Soviet supply depots and rear echelons. Entire tank brigades were immobilized as fuel convoys were destroyed by air raids. By early August, Operation Mars had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The Red Army had advanced no more than 15-20 kilometers on most sectors, while suffering approximately 300,000 casualties, including 100,000 killed or missing. Tank losses exceeded 1,000 vehicles. German losses, though far smaller, were still severe. Approximately 70,000 killed, wounded, or missing, reflecting the ferocity of the fighting. The front, however, remained largely unchanged. The failure of the summer offensive forced the Soviet command to reassess its strategy. Zhukov, while officially reporting limited success, privately acknowledged that the Rzhev sector had become a drain on manpower and resources. Nevertheless, Stalin insisted that pressure be maintained. Even as the Wehrmacht launched its southern campaign toward Stalingrad, Soviet armies around Rzhev continued local assaults, tying down German divisions that might otherwise have reinforced the south. For German soldiers, life in the salient became a relentless ordeal. The constant artillery bombardments, partisan attacks, and night raids eroded morale. The forests around Rzhev concealed thousands of Soviet snipers and raiding groups. Supply shortages worsened as Soviet partisans sabotaged rail lines and bridges west of Vyazma. Letters from German soldiers spoke of exhaustion, vermin-infested trenches, and the feeling of being trapped in a land of death. Civilians in the region fared no better. Entire villages were erased by bombardment or scorched earth tactics. Those remaining were forced into labor battalions or deported to the rear. Food scarcity led to starvation, and disease spread rapidly among refugees. For months, the Rzhev area existed as a wasteland of mud, ruins, and graves, a vast no-man's land where front lines shifted only by meters at a time. As summer turned to autumn, the Rzhev front symbolized the broader character of the Eastern Front in 1942, a struggle not for maneuver, but for endurance. While the Southern Theater would soon produce the dramatic reversal at Stalingrad, the fighting around Rzhev continued in grim obscurity. Tens of thousands died for ground that neither side could hold for long. Yet strategically, the Soviet offensive succeeded in one crucial respect. They fixed the German Ninth Army in place, preventing its redeployment to the south and indirectly contributing to the encirclement of German forces at Stalingrad later that year. By the end of 1942, the Rzhev-Vyazma salient had consumed more than 1 million lives in total casualties. Still, both sides prepared for yet another round of offensives. The Red Army had learned from its failures and refined its operational methods, while the Germans, though battered, continued to hold their fortified lines. The coming winter would bring a new chapter, the final Soviet effort to erase the salient once and for all. The Rzhev meat grinder, as soldiers on both sides called it, was far from over. As 1942 drew to a close, the Rzhev-Vyazma salient remained one of the most heavily contested sectors of the Eastern Front. For over a year, this region, stretching between the Volga and the Dnieper headwaters, had consumed divisions, resources, and entire armies in battles that seldom changed the front lines. The Germans still held the salient, their fortified lines forming a jagged arc threatening Moscow from the west. For the Soviets, its existence was intolerable. Even after the catastrophic losses of Operation Mars in the summer, the Stavka prepared yet another offensive. This time, the objective was not a reckless breakthrough, but a methodical campaign to eliminate the salient entirely. In the final months of 1942, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front changed dramatically. Far to the south, the German Sixth Army was encircled at Stalingrad, and the Soviet counteroffensive there, Operation Uranus, was unfolding with unprecedented success. As the Wehrmacht reeled from disaster on the Volga, the Soviet High Command saw an opportunity to strike simultaneously in the central sector, tying down German reserves and preventing the transfer of troops to the south. The Rzhev front was to serve as the northern arm of this grand strategy. General Georgy Zhukov, now among the most influential Soviet commanders, returned to direct planning for the renewed offensive. This operation, codenamed Operation Mars II in some documents, though later merged with the broader Rzhev-Vyazma strategic campaign, would again target the Ninth Army under General Model. The plan envisioned a concentric assault by the Kalinin and Western fronts to encircle Rzhev and destroy the defending forces. Unlike previous offensives, the new strategy emphasized coordination, concentration of artillery, and the element of surprise. The Red Army assembled massive resources for the operation. By January 1943, over 1.1 million troops, 2,500 tanks, and 16,000 guns and mortars were deployed along the Kalinin-Rzhev axis. The Kalinin front, under General Maxim Purkayev, fielded the 39th, 41st, and 22nd Armies. The Western Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, committed the 5th, 33rd, and 20th Armies. Together they faced the German Ninth Army, numbering approximately 350,000 men, supported by 700 tanks and 2,000 artillery pieces. Despite its apparent strength, the German Ninth Army was showing signs of strain. Continuous Soviet pressure throughout 1942 had inflicted severe losses, and reinforcements were scarce, as most German reserves were diverted southward to the collapsing front around Stalingrad. Ammunition shortages plagued artillery units, and the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain air superiority due to weather and overextension. Still, Model's defensive system around Rzhev remained formidable. 3 successive fortified belts, minefields, and an intricate network of trenches that extended for hundreds of kilometers. The Soviet offensive began on 2 February 1943 under the cover of dense snow and fog. Artillery preparation lasted over 2 hours, during which tens of thousands of shells rained down on German positions. Soviet infantry and tanks advanced immediately afterward, aiming to penetrate the first defensive belt along the Vazuza and Osuga rivers. Initial reports indicated success in several sectors. Near Olenino, elements of the 39th Army broke through the outer German positions. South of Rzhev, the 20th Army captured several strongpoints, including the village of Kolmitz. However, progress was slow and costly. German machine guns and anti-tank positions, carefully camouflaged, inflicted devastating losses. As in previous operations, Soviet coordination broke down amid the confusion of battle. The snow-covered forests and frozen rivers disoriented advancing units, and radio communication failed in several sectors. German counterattacks by mobile reserve groups, particularly from the 9th and 14th Panzer Divisions, stopped Soviet advances before they could develop into a full breakthrough. On the northern flank, the 39th and 41st Armies found themselves bogged down in the same swamps and forests where thousands of men had perished months earlier. Yet even as the offensive stalled, events outside Rzhev began to change the situation. The German defeat at Stalingrad in early February forced Hitler to reconsider his position along the Central Front. Army Group Center's exposed salient no longer served a strategic purpose. Instead, it threatened to become a trap. Soviet pressure from both flanks, combined with the risk of encirclement, prompted the German High Command to approve a withdrawal from the Rzhev-Vyazma sector. Model proposed a carefully planned retreat to shorter, more defensible lines west of Smolensk, a rare strategic withdrawal conducted under Hitler's approval. Operation Buffalo, the evacuation of the Rzhev salient, was launched in March 1943. Conducted with German precision, it involved the orderly withdrawal of over 350,000 troops, 50,000 vehicles, and nearly 1,000 artillery pieces. Model's forces systematically destroyed infrastructure as they retreated. Roads, bridges, railways, and entire villages were burned to deny the Soviets usable shelter or supply routes. Minefields and booby traps were laid along every major road. Civilians were forcibly evacuated and livestock slaughtered or driven west. Soviet reconnaissance detected signs of the withdrawal in mid-March, but uncertainty delayed their reaction. When the Red Army advanced to pursue the retreating Germans, they encountered a landscape deliberately devastated. Mines, scorched villages, and demolished bridges slowed progress, while rearguard actions by German covering units inflicted further losses. Nevertheless, by early April 1943, Soviet forces finally reoccupied Rzhev, Sikevka, and Vyazma, towns that had been battlegrounds for nearly 18 months. The scale of destruction defied description. Rzhev, once a town of 56,000 inhabitants, had been reduced to rubble. Fewer than 500 civilians were found alive in the ruins. Entire forests were stripped of trees, replaced by fields of wrecked vehicles and unburied corpses. The Volga River was choked with debris, and local villages had ceased to exist. What had once been a strategic salient had become a wasteland, a monument to attrition without victory. While the Soviet command celebrated the liberation as a triumph, the reality was more complex. The German withdrawal was conducted so skillfully that the Red Army failed to encircle or destroy major enemy formations. The Soviet forces reclaimed the ground, but at enormous cost, with cumulative casualties for the Rzhev-Vyazma campaigns exceeding 1.3 million. German losses, though smaller, were severe, approximately 400,000 killed, wounded, or missing between January 1942 and March 1943. The evacuation of the Rzhev salient marked the end of one of the longest and most grueling continuous engagements of the Second World War. For the Germans, it was a necessary consolidation that shortened their front by 200 kilometers and released divisions for operations elsewhere. For the Soviets, it was both a strategic success and a humanitarian catastrophe, a victory measured not in territory gained, but in the endurance of their soldiers and the cost in lives. By spring 1943, the front stabilized west of Smolensk, setting the stage for the next phase of the Eastern Front, the great battles of maneuver that would culminate at Kursk later that year. But for those who fought at Rzhev, the struggle left scars deeper than any single victory could erase. The Rzhev meat grinder, as veterans called it, had ended not with glory or conquest, but with silence. An entire region depopulated and destroyed, its rivers and forests filled with the remnants of two armies that had fought to exhaustion over the same blood-soaked ground. When the last German troops withdrew from the ruins of Rzhev in March 1943, the Red Army entered a landscape that seemed less a battlefield than a graveyard. The region had been fought over continuously for 17 months, subjected to bombardments, scorched earth destruction, and repeated offensives. Every kilometer bore the marks of war, trenches filled with frozen bodies, forests shattered by artillery, and villages erased from maps. The Soviet forces, while celebrating the liberation, soon realized that the cost of this victory was beyond comprehension. The Battle of Rzhev-Vyazma had ended, but its consequences, military, human, and psychological, were only beginning to unfold. The immediate aftermath of the German withdrawal presented enormous logistical and humanitarian challenges. Soviet engineers advancing behind the front were confronted with the terrain deliberately devastated during Operation Buffel. Mines covered nearly every road, bridge, and field. German engineers had planted over 500,000 explosive devices, including delayed action mines designed to detonate days or weeks after being disturbed. It took months for Soviet sapper units to clear the area, and even years later, the region remained dangerous. Villagers returning to rebuild their homes often perished in explosions. The surviving population of the Rzhev district numbered only a fraction of its pre-war size. Of the roughly 60,000 civilians who had lived in the area before the war, barely 5,000 remained. The rest had been killed, deported to forced labor in Germany, or displaced. Famine and disease were widespread. In liberated villages, Soviet medical brigades found families living in dugouts, feeding on bark and frozen potatoes. Reports from local authorities described entire communities where not a single cow, horse, or tool remains. Rebuilding efforts began immediately, but progress was slow. Even by 1945, many towns still lacked electricity or functioning water systems. Militarily, the recapture of Rzhev and Vyazma brought a crucial change to the Eastern Front. For the first time since the autumn of 1941, the approaches to Moscow were entirely secure. The destruction of the Rzhev-Vyazma salient shortened the front by more than 200 kilometers, allowing the Soviet command to redeploy forces southward for the upcoming summer campaign. Dozens of rifle divisions, artillery regiments, and tank brigades were transferred to the Bryansk, Central, and Voronezh fronts, formations that would later take part in the Battle of Kursk. The German retreat, while tactically successful, conceded the strategic initiative to the Red Army once and for all. General Zhukov, who had overseen multiple offensives in the Rzhev sector, later described the campaign as the most difficult and costly of my career. His words reflected not only the scale of Soviet losses, estimated at over 1.3 million killed, wounded, and missing, but also the sense of futility that surrounded the operation. Despite the eventual liberation, the Red Army failed to achieve its operational goal of encircling and annihilating the German Ninth Army. Instead, it had fought a series of grinding battles that achieved only territorial recovery. Within the Soviet military archives, commanders admitted privately that the price of Rzhev exceeded its value. For the Germans, the withdrawal was regarded as one of Model's most skillful defensive operations. The Ninth Army successfully evacuated nearly all its heavy equipment and personnel, avoiding the catastrophic encirclement that had destroyed the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Nevertheless, the psychological impact was severe. Hitler's insistence that Rzhev be held to the last man, had cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and its eventual abandonment was seen as a concession of strategic failure. Many German officers later referred to Rzhev as the grave of the Ninth Army. Morale among survivors was deeply shaken. The conditions on the battlefield reflected the intensity of the fighting. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken after the German withdrawal revealed a landscape devoid of vegetation, fields pocked by millions of shell craters, riverbanks eroded by explosions, and forests leveled by fire. Soviet burial teams reported collecting as many as 10,000 bodies per week in the months following liberation. The majority could not be identified. The Rzhev region became one of the largest unmarked cemeteries of the Eastern Front, where entire units disappeared without trace. The Red Army's experience at Rzhev produced several lasting tactical and organizational changes. The failures of 1942 had exposed critical flaws in Soviet command coordination, reconnaissance, and logistics. In response, the General Staff introduced stricter planning procedures and expanded its use of artillery concentrations, engineer units, and radio communications. By mid-1943, Soviet offensives exhibited far greater synchronization between infantry, armor, and air support, an evolution directly shaped by the lessons learned at Rzhev. The bitter experience also convinced the Stavka to avoid large frontal assaults against entrenched positions whenever possible, emphasizing encirclement and operational maneuver instead. For the civilian population of Western Russia, however, the end of the Rzhev campaign brought little immediate relief. German occupation authorities had left a scorched zone extending hundreds of kilometers. Fields were mined or salted, livestock slaughtered, and food stores burned. Soviet reconstruction teams estimated that 90% of the region's housing stock was destroyed. Industrial facilities, schools, and hospitals were non-existent. The return of Soviet administration restored some sense of order, but famine and disease persisted through 1944. Survivors described the post-liberation landscape as a country of ash and bones. Politically, the recapture of the salient strengthened Stalin's confidence in the Red Army's resilience. The end of the Rzhev front demonstrated that the Soviet state could recover from the disasters of 1941 and 1942. Propaganda portrayed the operation as a triumph of perseverance and sacrifice, emphasizing the liberation of the last foothold of the enemy near Moscow. In reality, the victory was ambiguous. While the Soviet flag now flew over Rzhev, the human and material cost was immense, and the destruction rendered the region uninhabitable for years. The soldiers who survived the campaign carried its memory as a private burden. Unlike other great battles such as Stalingrad or Kursk, the Rzhev fighting received little public commemoration. The secrecy surrounding the scale of Soviet casualties meant that the operation was rarely mentioned in official histories during the Stalin era. Veterans called it the Forgotten Battle, a term that later became synonymous with the entire Rzhev campaign. Only decades later did historians begin to reconstruct the full magnitude of the fighting through declassified archives. In military terms, the end of the Rzhev-Vyazma operations closed one of the costliest chapters of the war's central sector. The front stabilized west of Smolensk, and both sides shifted focus toward future operations, Operation Citadel for the Germans, and the planned counteroffensives that would follow it. Yet beneath the strategic balance sheets lay an irreplaceable loss. Hundreds of thousands of men buried beneath the forests and swamps of the upper Volga, the remains of an army that had fought over the same ground for more than a year. By the time spring returned in 1943, the snow around Rzhev was still streaked with metal fragments and bones. The rivers ran red with rust from thousands of wrecked tanks and guns. The once vibrant heartland of Western Russia had been transformed into a desolate plain where, for months, no birds sang and no crops grew. For both the Soviet Union and Germany, Rzhev was a bitter lesson in the limits of endurance, a place where neither side could claim victory, only survival. The summer of 1943 brought a fragile calm to the lands around Rzhev and Vyazma. The front line had moved west, and for the first time since 1941, The region was no longer a combat zone, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath the surface lay the wreckage of one of the most destructive campaigns of the war. The Red Army engineers and reconstruction brigades that moved into the area found not a liberated region, but a ruin without boundaries. The ground itself was poisoned with metal, bones, and the remnants of two armies that had fought each other to exhaustion. In military terms, the end of the Rzhev-Vyazma campaign allowed the Soviet command to redirect massive forces southward, where the fate of the war would soon be decided. Dozens of divisions, artillery corps, and tank brigades withdrawn from the Central Front reinforced the Voronezh, Bryansk, and Steppe fronts in preparation for the decisive battles around Kursk. The Soviet leadership understood that the attrition at Rzhev had served a strategic purpose. It had fixed Germany's Army Group Center in place for nearly 2 years, draining its manpower and equipment reserves while preventing large-scale redeployments to other sectors. For the Germans, the loss of the Rzhev salient was a double-edged outcome. On one hand, the evacuation shortened their defensive line by hundreds of kilometers and released several divisions for use elsewhere. On the other, the continuous fighting had bled the Ninth Army to the point of near collapse. Many of its divisions were reduced to half or even one-third of their original strength. Replacements were few, and the psychological toll on the survivors was immense. Soldiers who had fought at Rzhev referred to it as Der Blutzirkus, the circus of blood. Letters and diaries recovered from German archives reveal fatigue, hopelessness, and disbelief at the scale of losses sustained for territory that no longer held strategic value. The Red Army's own condition was scarcely better. Entire divisions had been rebuilt 3 or 4 times during the Rzhev operations. Units that had entered the campaign in 1942 with 10,000 men often emerged with fewer than 3,000. Hospitals in the Moscow and Kalinin regions overflowed with wounded. For many soldiers, the end of the Rzhev battles was not liberation, but survival against impossible odds. Their commanders rotated them out of the line only long enough to receive new conscripts before redeploying them to new fronts. As Soviet troops advanced through the reclaimed territory, they documented the devastation. The towns of Rzhev, Sychevka, and Gzhatsk had been erased by artillery fire. Bridges lay collapsed into rivers. Roads were cratered beyond repair. Fields once cultivated for grain were now littered with wrecked vehicles and human remains. Forests that had provided cover during the battles were burned to stumps by incendiary shells. War correspondents described the area as a dead zone extending 200 kilometers in every direction. In some places, the fighting had been so intense that the earth itself had changed color from the mixture of blood, ash, and rust. Reconstruction began immediately, but the process was monumental. The Soviet government established the Rzhev Restoration Commission, which coordinated the resettlement of refugees and clearing of mines. Hundreds of thousands of unexploded munitions were removed, and temporary housing was constructed for returning civilians. Yet progress was painfully slow. The countryside was depopulated, labor was scarce, and transport infrastructure was non-existent. Agricultural recovery took years, and by the war's end, large portions of the former salient remained wasteland. While soldiers and civilians worked to rebuild, the memory of the Rzhev battles faded from public consciousness. The Soviet state, eager to emphasize decisive victories such as Stalingrad and Kursk, avoided discussing operations that had produced enormous losses for limited gains. Official wartime communiques mentioned the liberation of Rzhev only briefly, without acknowledging the 18 months of fighting that preceded it. For many veterans, the silence was painful. The men who had survived the Rzhev meat grinder received no special recognition or decorations. Their comrades remained unburied, scattered across fields that had turned into mass graves. In post-war Germany, too, the campaign was largely overshadowed by the disasters at Stalingrad and Kursk. Yet, among Wehrmacht veterans, Rzhev became synonymous with endurance and futility. German military historians would later note that the Rzhev sector absorbed as many casualties as Stalingrad, though it yielded no decisive outcome. The experience there contributed to the growing sense among German officers that the war in the East had become unwinnable, a contest of attrition that Germany could not sustain. By late 1943, the strategic focus of the war had moved far to the west, toward Smolensk and beyond. The Rzhev front no longer existed, but its legacy endured in the form of destroyed divisions, shattered towns, and a landscape permanently altered by war. In the Soviet military archives, planners studying the lessons of the campaign concluded that its real contribution had been indirect. It had exhausted German strength, forced the enemy to commit critical reserves, and prepared the ground for the Soviet resurgence of 1943 and 1944. The battlefields of Rzhev and Vyazma thus stood as the hinge between the desperate defensive wars of 1941 and the great offensives that would carry the Red Army to Berlin. It was a campaign of attrition, fought without glory, that demonstrated the sheer scale of endurance demanded on the Eastern Front. When survivors later returned, they found that even the forests had not yet grown back, and that the only traces of their struggle were the rusting helmets and sunken trenches still visible beneath the moss. Rzhev had ceased to be a front, but it remained a wound, one that neither army nor nation would soon forget. The legacy of the Battle of Rzhev-Vyazma extended far beyond its military significance. By the late stages of the war, the name Rzhev had become a symbol whispered among soldiers, a word associated not with victory, but with endless sacrifice. For those who had fought there, it represented the purest form of attrition, a campaign in which tens of thousands died for every kilometer gained, and where the line between triumph and survival disappeared entirely. When Soviet historians and propagandists reviewed the campaigns of 1942 to 43, they found little in Rzhev that could serve as a rallying symbol. Unlike the dramatic victory at Stalingrad or the defense of Leningrad, the Rzhev front offered no decisive breakthrough, no encirclement, and no clear enemy destruction. Instead, it was a record of grinding offensives, partial successes, and staggering losses. The Red Army eventually reclaimed the territory, but only after the Germans had withdrawn by their own decision. In official reports, the campaign was described simply as operations in the central direction. Its true magnitude, measured in over 1.3 million Soviet casualties, was kept secret for decades. Among the soldiers themselves, the memories of Rzhev were different. Veterans spoke of battles fought knee-deep in snow, of forests where trees were splintered into dust by shellfire, and of entire regiments that vanished overnight. Survivors described the psychological toll of fighting for months under constant artillery fire and air raids with no possibility of rest or retreat. In diaries later recovered from the front, one Soviet officer wrote, "There is no movement here, only death and mud. We dig the ground, and the ground throws back bones." For German soldiers, the memory was equally grim. The Wehrmacht's Ninth Army, under Model's command, had endured some of the heaviest fighting of the entire Eastern Front. Many units spent more than a year in the same trenches, repelling one Soviet assault after another. Letters home described Rzhev as the graveyard of our youth. Even the German General Staff admitted privately that the campaign served no purpose beyond maintaining appearances. Yet the High Command continued to reinforce the salient, convinced that abandoning it would weaken the overall defensive system. This fixation tied down hundreds of thousands of men and contributed indirectly to Germany's defeats elsewhere. As the war moved westward, Rzhev's significance faded from the public eye, overshadowed by the victories of 1943 and 1944. Still, for those living in the region, the war never truly ended. The destruction left behind was total. Out of the pre-war population of the Rzhev district, more than 80% had perished or been displaced. Villages once known for agriculture and crafts were now empty fields. Rebuilding them required clearing vast minefields, filling craters, and replanting forests stripped bare by artillery fire. Entire generations grew up amid wreckage. Even into the 1950s, farmers routinely uncovered helmets, bones, and rusted rifles while plowing their land. The environmental damage was immense. The bombardments and deforestation changed the water flow of the Volga tributaries, causing widespread flooding and erosion. Thousands of hectares of farmland were rendered unusable due to unexploded ordnance. Forest regrowth took decades, and the scars of trenches remained visible for years. For the Soviet government, the reconstruction of the Rzhev region became part of a broader campaign to restore life to the liberated territories. However, resources were limited, and most of the effort focused on restoring transport routes and military infrastructure rather than civilian life. Commemoration of the battle came late. During Stalin's rule, discussion of the Rzhev fighting was discouraged, as it raised uncomfortable questions about Soviet operational failures and losses. Officially, the campaign was subsumed under the broader narrative of the Moscow counteroffensive. Only after Stalin's death in 1953 did war historians begin cautiously acknowledging the scale of the fighting. In the 1960s and 1970s, local memorials were erected, often initiated by veterans rather than the state. One of the most haunting tributes came from poet Alexander Tvardovsky, himself a veteran of the Rzhev Front, whose poem I Was Killed Near Rzhev gave voice to the countless soldiers who died unnamed and unburied. Its verses, "We lie in the grass, in the darkness and snow. We were only men, we did what we could," became a quiet epitaph for an entire generation. In the decades that followed, historians gradually reassessed the campaign's importance. Modern research revealed that the Rzhev-Vyazma operations tied down up to 30% of all German forces on the Eastern Front at their height, significantly limiting the Wehrmacht's flexibility elsewhere. The attrition suffered there directly influenced German inability to respond effectively to the Soviet offensives at Stalingrad and later at Kursk. Thus, while tactically indecisive, the Rzhev campaign played a crucial strategic role in eroding the German war machine. By the end of the 20th century, the Rzhev battlefield had become a place of pilgrimage for historians, veterans, and families searching for the remains of the missing. Excavation teams unearthed relics year after year, helmets, mess kits, weapons, and letters preserved in the soil. Each discovery was a reminder that the battle's human cost remained incompletely counted. Memorial complexes were finally constructed in the 2000s, including the towering Rzhev Memorial to the Soviet Soldier, unveiled in 2020, which honored both the scale of the fighting and the silence that had followed it. Yet even today, the Battle of Rzhev-Vyazma remains forgotten. In comparison with the great turning points of the war, its very nature defies narrative resolution. It offers no clear heroes or victories, only endurance and tragedy. But within the continuum of the Eastern Front, Rzhev stands as one of the defining crucibles of modern warfare, a place where industrial-age armies met the limits of their power, where millions fought not for conquest, but for survival. The land still bears their memory, and the forests that have since grown over the trenches remain, in their quiet way, a living monument to the men who never returned. In the broader history of the Eastern Front, the Battle of Rzhev-Vyazma occupies a paradoxical place, central in scale and consequence, yet peripheral in collective memory. The campaign stretched from January 1942 to March 1943, encompassing multiple offensives and counteroffensives, the involvement of millions of soldiers, and casualties exceeding those of Stalingrad. Yet because it ended without a dramatic breakthrough or decisive surrender, it was overshadowed by the more visible triumphs that followed. For both the Soviet Union and Germany, Rzhev became a story best left untold, a campaign whose cost was too immense to fit within the narratives of glory or heroism that defined wartime remembrance. By the time the guns fell silent around Rzhev, the war itself had already shifted its center of gravity. In the south, the Wehrmacht reeled from the catastrophe at Stalingrad. In the north, Leningrad's blockade was weakening. The fighting around the upper Volga seemed, to both sides, like a grim echo of an earlier stage of the conflict. But strategically, the year-long struggle for Rzhev had already altered the war's trajectory. It had tied down up to a quarter of all German divisions on the Eastern Front at the very moment when the Wehrmacht sought to regain the initiative in the south. It also drained the Red Army's strength so severely that it delayed subsequent Soviet offensives by months. In effect, Rzhev consumed the reserves of both empires and reshaped their capacity for the campaigns that followed. For the Soviet command, the lessons of Rzhev were bitter but essential. The failures of 1942 exposed the limitations of Soviet operational doctrine, the tendency to overextend offensives without adequate reconnaissance or logistical support. The Red Army's repeated attempts to breach the German Ninth Army's defenses proved that sheer numbers could not compensate for tactical rigidity. After the war, Soviet generals acknowledged privately that the Rzhev campaign forced them to modernize command structures, integrate artillery and air coordination, and improve logistical planning. These reforms bore fruit at Kursk and later in Operation Bagration. In this sense, Rzhev became an unspoken rehearsal for the victories that followed. For the Germans, Rzhev represented the exhaustion of the Wehrmacht's early war superiority. The Ninth Army, though it held its lines against overwhelming odds, did so at an unsustainable cost. From 1942 onward, German industry could no longer replace losses in men or materiel at the rate required to maintain the front. Rzhev's attrition consumed the best of Germany's trained infantry and panzer divisions, leaving gaps that would later cripple its ability to resist Soviet advances in 1943 and 1944. Even the successful withdrawal during Operation Büffel failed to mask the underlying weakness. Model's defensive achievements could not alter the strategic reality. Germany had entered a war of attrition it could not win. The human experience of Rzhev defied quantification. In Soviet records, casualty lists grew so long that local offices ceased updating them in real time. Whole villages sent every able-bodied man to the front. Few returned. In letters preserved from the 30th and 31st Armies, soldiers spoke not of patriotism or vengeance, but of endurance, of surviving one more night under bombardment, of sharing frozen bread with comrades in dugouts, of walking over ground so churned with bodies that it was impossible to dig new trenches without unearthing the dead. Civilians, too, lived through a nightmare that rarely entered official histories. Those who remained during the occupation were used as laborers or human shields. When Soviet forces finally retook the region, they found thousands of civilians dead from starvation or execution, their homes burned, their villages erased. In post-war decades, the battle's memory endured primarily among those who fought it. Veterans' accounts, often suppressed by censors, described Rzhev as the crucible of the front, a place where men learned the futility and persistence that defined the war in the East. The secrecy surrounding the campaign created an atmosphere of silence. Officially, the Soviet Union presented an unbroken narrative of victory, but privately, Rzhev was remembered as a place of annihilation. It was not until the late 1980s, during the period of glasnost, that Soviet historians began publishing documents acknowledging the full scale of the losses. The numbers shocked the public: over 1.3 million Soviet soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, compared to approximately 400,000 German casualties. The rediscovery of Rzhev's history in the late 20th century reshaped perceptions of the Eastern Front. It revealed that the path to victory had not been a sequence of triumphs, but a series of staggering sacrifices. It also forced a reevaluation of the Soviet command's decisions. The persistence in attacking fortified positions for minimal gain, the reluctance to adapt to terrain and weather, and the political pressures that demanded constant offensives regardless of feasibility. These revelations did not diminish the courage of the soldiers who fought there. Rather, they underscored the human cost of strategic overreach. Modern military historians regard Rzhev as one of the earliest examples of total attritional warfare on the Eastern Front, a precursor to the later battles of Kursk and the Vistula. The campaign's dynamics illustrated how the industrial and logistical capacities of the warring powers, rather than maneuver or tactics alone, would determine the outcome of the war. In the endless forests and swamps of the Upper Volga, the limits of modern mechanized warfare became apparent. Tanks bogged down, aircraft grounded by weather, supply lines immobilized by mud and frost. The front stagnated not because either side willed it so, but because the land itself swallowed their ambitions. By the early 2000s, renewed archaeological efforts in the Rzhev region uncovered evidence that added dimension to the written record. Excavation teams found mass graves containing thousands of soldiers, Soviet and German alike, often buried where they fell. Personal belongings, identification tags, and letters offered glimpses into the human side of the campaign. One unearthed note, sealed in a metal case, read simply, "If they find me, tell my wife I died near Rzhev. I fought until the end." Such artifacts transformed the statistics of the battle into stories of individuals, restoring humanity to what had once been an abstract tragedy. In this way, the memory of Rzhev evolved from silence to recognition. What had once been dismissed as a failed offensive became understood as one of the most grueling struggles of the entire war, a battle that tested the endurance of armies and the resilience of nations. Its true legacy lies not in the territory gained or lost, but in the endurance of those who fought without glory, who lived through the unending bombardments, and who left behind a land that still bears their traces. Today, the fields of Rzhev stand quiet, reclaimed by forest and grass, yet beneath the soil remains the largest unmarked graveyard of the Second World War, a silent reminder that victory, when it finally came, was built upon the bones of those who never left the Volga forests alive. The final phase of the Rzhev-Vyazma campaign came not with a grand assault or a negotiated peace, but through exhaustion and withdrawal. By early 1943, both armies were drained to the edge of collapse. The German Ninth Army, battered and isolated in the Rzhev salient, held a bulge that no longer served a strategic purpose. The Red Army's repeated offensives, despite enormous losses, had finally eroded the Wehrmacht's confidence in maintaining such a vulnerable position. For months, intelligence intercepts had suggested that the Germans might attempt a retreat, but Stalin remained skeptical, fearing a trap. When the withdrawal finally began in March 1943 under the codename Operation Büffel, it was executed with characteristic precision and cruelty. The Germans evacuated the entire salient in less than 3 weeks, systematically destroying everything they left behind. Villages were burned, roads mined, bridges demolished. Over 3,000 square kilometers of land were left barren. The population that had survived the occupation was forcibly deported to the rear or executed under accusations of collaboration. The scorched earth policy extended to the countryside. Livestock was slaughtered, crops were destroyed, and even wells were poisoned. It was one of the most thorough withdrawals of the war, leaving nothing that could aid the advancing Red Army. When Soviet forces finally entered Rzhev on March 3, 1943, they found a wasteland. Of the pre-war population of 57,000, barely 150 remained. Entire districts had ceased to exist. The once important transport hub had been reduced to a field of ruins, its streets littered with frozen corpses and debris. Red Army engineers struggled to clear mines and booby traps, losing men even after the fighting had ended. In reports sent to Moscow, one officer described Rzhev as a city erased by fire and ice. The symbolic value of retaking it could not obscure the scale of devastation. The Red Army had finally captured what was, in effect, a grave. The German withdrawal marked the end of a year-long nightmare, but it also denied the Soviets the decisive victory they had sought. There was no encirclement, no mass surrender, no opportunity for propaganda triumph. Instead, the enemy had slipped away on its own terms, leaving only ruins. In military terms, the front line moved westward. In human terms, little changed. The Red Army advanced through a landscape of death, too exhausted to celebrate. As one war correspondent wrote, "We took Rzhev not from the Germans, but from the winter, from the swamp, from death itself." For the soldiers who had survived the campaign, the sense of closure was elusive. Many units had lost over 70% of their personnel during the previous year. Replacements arrived, but few veterans remained to train them. The terrain, so often soaked in blood, became a natural cemetery. Thousands of bodies lay unburied beneath the snow, and spring thaws revealed the scale of the losses. Field hospitals overflowed with the wounded. many suffering from frostbite and malnutrition. The Red Army, though victorious in territorial terms, emerged from Rzhev in a state of near exhaustion. The Soviet High Command soon shifted attention southward, where the decisive battles of Kursk and the Dnieper crossings awaited. Rzhev faded from official reports, reduced to a footnote in the greater story of the war. For Stalin, the campaign was politically inconvenient, a costly, indecisive struggle that conflicted with the myth of unbroken Soviet progress. The word Rzhev appeared rarely in speeches or textbooks for decades. Only in private correspondence did officers acknowledge its significance. Marshal Zhukov himself, who had overseen several of the operations, later admitted that the campaign taught more than any other about the limits of human endurance. After the war, the reconstruction of Rzhev and its surroundings took years. Mines and shells were still being discovered in the 1950s. Entire forests had to be cleared before resettlement could begin. The population slowly returned, building new homes atop layers of unmarked graves. A few monuments appeared, modest obelisks erected by veterans or families searching for missing relatives. But for the most part, the land remained silent. For decades, the Rzhev front was known among soldiers as the Forgotten War. It was not until the end of the Soviet Union that the truth began to surface. Archival releases and excavation projects revealed the full scope of the campaign's casualties and its operational complexity. Historians established that between January 1942 and March 1943, more than 1.3 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in the Rzhev sector, while German losses exceeded 400,000. These figures transformed the public's understanding of the Eastern Front, challenging long-held narratives about where the war's decisive moments truly lay. Today, the fields and forests around Rzhev stand peaceful once again, but beneath their calm surfaces lies the memory of a struggle that reshaped the war's course. The campaign may have lacked the drama of Stalingrad or the triumph of Berlin, yet its influence was profound. It drained the Wehrmacht's strength, tested Soviet endurance, and demonstrated that victory in the East would come only through attrition and sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. The Battle of Rzhev-Vyazma remains, in the end, a story of endurance rather than triumph, of soldiers who fought for ground that meant little in conditions that defied survival. The land remembers what history tried to forget. Beneath the soil lie the relics of two armies and the echo of their struggle, preserved in silence. It was there, in the swamps and forests of the upper Volga, that the myth of invincibility on both sides was buried, and the real human cost of total war revealed itself in full.